Welcome to Hope of Glory Ministries. I'm Reverend Sandra Campbell. I would like to speak to anyone who's been called to stand in the gap in their family. A gap is a very special space that is created when something that should be there is missing. Gaps can be emotionally, psychologically, and financially draining. Gaps can also be very destructive, especially when something as important as a father and a mother is missing, and someone else, you perhaps, have been left to raise a child that you didn't birth, but you accepted the responsibility to stand in that gap. I firmly believe that God calls very special people to be the ones to stand in gaps. I know that not everybody can do it. So if that's you, you're special. You were chosen for this assignment. Such was the case with Mordecai. We find that after the exile of the Babylonian captivity, when the Jews returned, that they were assimilated back into their society. And many of them did return to Jerusalem. However, this one particular man named Mordecai was left with a very unusual inheritance. We find that he was left to raise a child that he didn't father. And so the Bible tells us that her name was Esther, and that her mother and father did not come back up out of captivity, which means that they died in slavery. We know that when the Jews returned, because they were coming out of slavery, that they were still looked down upon as a slave race, so to speak. Well, anyway, the Bible tells us that Esther, this child that Mordecai was left to raise, was very beautiful. We know that he raised her as if she was his own child. We know that he raised her to love the Lord in all of the Jewish traditions. We know that a parent-child relationship did exist there. He stood in the gap, and he was a father and her mother. He stood in the gap, and he provided her with a home. He accepted this responsibility, and he sacrificed his own life, and he raised her as unto the Lord. And she grew up to be a very beautiful child, inside and out. We find that it wasn't long before other people started taking note of Esther's great beauty. And eventually one day, the king sent men out from his court to find all of the beautiful women, because he was in search of a new queen. And this is King Xerxes of Persia. And so Esther, because of her great beauty, was chosen. And the Bible tells us that Esther was just a special person, and that she had favor on her life, favor with everybody that she came into contact with in the palace. And that it wasn't long before the king had chosen her as his wife above all of the other concubines who were in the palace being groomed. Well, we know that Esther spent her life as a Jew watching her cousin stand in the gap for what was missing in her life. And so she kind of had a good understanding of what it meant to sacrifice your life for someone else. Well, the day came when she herself would be called upon to stand in the gap, because one of King Xerxes' trusted friends and countrymen decided to make a decree to kill all of the Jews. Now, mind you that King Xerxes did not know that Esther was a Jew, because Mordecai, her father, had told her, not to reveal that part of her heritage to her husband, so she didn't. Well, finally, she had to, be upfront with her husband, and she went to him, and because she did, she risked her life going to him in a desperate plea to save the Jewish people. A whole race of people were about to be annihilated because of, guess what? Racism. But she went to her husband, and even though he had not extended the scepter, which was an act punishable by death, to go to a king without permission, she did it to save a whole race of people. Mordecai went to her and said, Esther, you know what? Who knows whether you have been elevated to this position to save your father's house for such a time as this. Maybe this is what my standing in the gap for you was all about. Maybe this is what that great beauty you have is all about. Maybe this is what the favor on your life was all about, so that one day you would be able to stand in the gap for someone else. And she saved a whole race of people. That was the big picture for such a time as this, to save your own race. Wow. Friend, I don't know what your sacrifice is and why you were chosen with this assignment to stand in the gap, but stand on anyhow. I don't care if people laugh at you and say that baby you're raising doesn't look anything like you. Stand on anyhow. I don't care if you didn't birth it. Stand on anyhow. Your reward is going to be great in heaven. And God has not been sleeping on the last 5, 10, 15, or 20 years that you've sacrificed to stand in that gap. Remember, He only calls special people for that assignment. God bless.